Skull Servant is an interesting deck build because the build can be taken in multiple directions. Due to its multiple path deck design, Skull Servant decks can be somewhat nasty in a competitive environment. So, what path did I take when building my Skull Servant deck? Let's find out. Obviously, when building a Skull Servant deck, one must run 3 copies of King of the Skull Servants. Not much needs to be said about King, except it is the beat stick of the deck. Its special summoning ability is limited in its usefulness because when it's strong enough to do something effective on the battlefield, it really is not going to be destroyed as a result of battle unless either battling with something equipped with Moon Mirror Shield or backup Bionis, or if it's flipped face down by some card effect. So the effect is nice to have as kind of a rider, but don't expect too much from it. Moving on to the direct support for King, my card allotments may get a few eyebrow raises from other Skull Servant players because I only run 2 copies of the Lady in White, 2 copies of Wightmare, and 1 copy of Wightprince. Some may balk, exclaiming that each one of these monsters is being run at 1 fewer copy than it should, but other than deck space, why do I particularly run this breakdown instead of what I feel is the more common breakdown of, while the Lady in White is a great card for when King is on the field with sufficient attack points, it really is not that useful otherwise, especially for this deck build. 2200 defense is solid, but it is unlikely for this card to stay on the field for more than 1 or 2 turns against other high quality decks. Therefore, my strategy with this card largely involves dumping it into the graveyard with Wightprince or Uni-Zombie and then reviving it later when it's much more effective. I typically don't want to draw it into my hand. Therefore, 2 copies is the right number for this strategy because 1 is a little too dicey. It might get removed from play, or I might draw it and then I'm stuck with it in my hand. And 3 is too often results in me definitely drawing a copy, which, as I said, in a lot of respects is kind of a wasted draw. I run 2 copies of Wightmare because with only 1 copy of Wightprince, there really is little need of a 3rd copy. For you're not going to be doing a lot of banishing in this deck, so the recovery from banishment isn't that valuable, especially if your opponent's not doing any banishing. And the simple fact is, outside of that effect, it's not really that useful of a card, at least in my experience. I only run 1 Wightprince because 1 copy is able to do a nice job of deck thinning and powering up the King, but in my opinion, it's really not a very good card in multiple because it promotes running more, as I guess I describe it, only situationally helpful card to aid in the usefulness of its own effect. And I don't really get a lot of value out of the Lady in White or Wightmare at 3, but if you run Wightprince at 2, you almost kind of have to run the Lady in White and Wightmare at 3, so you get the extra utility out of that second Wightprince. Finally, I run 2 copies of Skull Servant to help optimize Wightprince's effect, as well as for a secondary purpose that will be seen later. Rounding out the remaining monsters, I run 3 copies of Uni-Zombie for support, Synchro plays, as well as deck to the graveyard plays, which is one of the components that makes zombie decks flow so effectively. The only real problem with Uni-Zombie is the rather fair attack restriction effect that limits the ability of your non-zombie synchro monsters to do something on the turn they're summoned, because frequently you are going to be changing Uni-Zombie's level. I also run 3 copies of Mezuki, a staple for zombie decks, for its effective graveyard revival and slightly above average attack power. I run 1 copy of Zombie Master because it works pretty nicely. Multiple copies get a little dicey in their effectiveness, but 1 copy you can bring them out, dump something from your hand, bring out another King of the Skull Servants from the graveyard or something, or an Uni-Zombie and make a synchro play. I run 3 copies of Pyramid Turtle for searching and field control, creating another opportunity to put the Lady, Uni-Zombie, Zombie Master, even the King himself on the field when appropriate. Some people don't like Battle Searchers, I know, I seem to stress that a lot in my deck build, but the versatility of Pyramid Turtle's searching ability is remarkably useful for this deck. Finally, with a sufficient number of dark monsters and an effective level of graveyard control, I run 1 copy of Dark Armed Dragon. Moving on to the spells, I run my 3 general spell staples, 1 Raigeki, 1 Book of Moon, and 1 Soul Charge. Being a dark deck and having the ability to recover ladies and kings from the remove from play zone, 1 copy of Allure of Darkness is pretty much automatic. To help support Uni-Zombie and the graveyard presence, I run 1 copy of Foolish Burial. Back row can be a problem for this deck at times, so I run 2 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon, which I will definitely upgrade to 2 copies of Twin Twister when Breaker of Shadows is released, because the discard is not a detriment at all for zombie decks 90-something% of the time, and sometimes it actually helps. Oh, I think I will dump this Mezuki into the graveyard, blow up 2 of your back row, and oh, now I can make even more plays than I would have been able to make if I just had a single Mystic Space Typhoon. Zombies have one of the best revival spells in the game in Book of Life. For my tastes in this deck, 2 copies is appropriate. I used to run 3, but it got a little cloggy against Pendulum decks because of its requirement that you have to remove an opponent's monster from the graveyard. King is a level 1 monster, so 1 copy of 1 for 1 is appropriate for both putting fuel in the graveyard, be it for King directly or a Mezuki, as well as getting King on the field. Also, with all of the low attack point monsters, or the monsters that don't mind being in the graveyard, as well as all of the cannot destroy or target me with card effects cards running around for opposing decks that you'll be facing with this deck, I think 3 copies of Creature Swap are very effective. Finally, here's where I decide for the hybridization path of this deck. I run 2 copies of Dragon's Mirror and 1 copy of Mass Change 2. Dragon's Mirror is useful in 2 respects. Skull Servant is a normal monster, so if both copies are in the graveyard, Dragon's Mirror opens the door to one of the best fusion monsters in the game, maybe the best fusion monster in the game in the given meta, First of the Dragons. Also, Dragonecro Nethersoul Dragon only requires 2 zombie monsters and can be rather nasty itself with its attack reduction and token summoning effect. The inclusion of Mass Change 2 is rather obvious, Dark Law. Finally, closing up the trap cards, I just run 3 copies of Royal Decree. I think when Breaker of Shadows comes out, you're going to have this change in how decks are built in the construct that you're going to have people running a lot of Solemn Notices. So then to counter that, you're either going to have people running Twin Twisters, or you're going to have people running a lot of just Royal Decrees to shut down those Solemn Notices. Then you're going to have, of course, the decks that have certain specific trap cards that they need to succeed, like Ritual Beasts have their Steeds in Ambush, and I think those decks are going to have a lot of trouble in Breaker of Shadows, because you're going to have all these other decks running either Royal Decree, or you're going to have them running a bunch of Twin Twisters and MSTs to try to deal with those Solemn Notices. So, because this deck really doesn't have any deck critical traps, I think just going with 3 copies of Royal Decree is fairly solid. Obviously, though, if you're facing decks that don't run a lot of back row, you should side these Royal Decrees out for something more protective base, more fitting for dealing with those decks. An interesting side deck option in the near future might be forming kind of a double hybrid. This deck as you see now, and then in your side deck put a number of those new zombie archetype, Shiranui support cards, so then you could sub out the Royal Decrees and sub in multiple copies of Sword of Swallow along with some of the other monsters like Chief Priest and Samurai, which can be very effective counterplays if you're facing somebody that doesn't run a lot of back row, but might run a lot of monsters, or might be able to swarm the field with a lot of monsters, or a good Pendulum deck. So I think when Breaker of Shadows comes out, you're going to have a very nice hybridization side deck option between the build as you see right now, and you can swap in some of those Shiranui monsters. Alright, anyways, moving on. For the extra deck, I run, obviously, the 1 copy of First of the Dragons, the 1 copy of Dragonecro Nethersoul Dragon, the 1 copy of Masked Hero Dark Law. Because we can Synchro in this deck, thanks to Uni-Zombie, 1 copy of Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, 1 copy of Beelze of the Diabolic Dragons, 1 copy of Void Ogre Dragon. I run 1 copy of PSY-Framelord Omega to return Mezuki's and Skull Servant material back from the Banish Zone to the graveyard. 1 copy of Crimson Blader. 1 copy of Clearwing Synchro Dragon. 1 copy of Black Rose Dragon. 1 Red Wyvern. And closing up the Synchros, 1 Hi-Speedroid Chanbara. And not surprisingly, I only run the kind of what I think are the 3 rank 4 staples, number 101, Castel, and XYZ Dragon. In the end, I think the key to making a King of the Skull Servants deck competitive is to ensure that there are other options that can carry the deck through those times when the King is not available to lead the charge without significantly reducing the efficiency of your King plays. In my experience, this deck accomplishes that balance fairly nicely. You have the fusion and synchro plays, you have field control, you have swarming, as well as even the ability to swap monsters with the opponent to produce advantage. Well, that's my King of the Skull Servants deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.